hello, all you daring dragonflies out there. Welcome to another episode of A Little Greener, a podcast all about conservation, sustainability, and nature. We're happy to have you back. My name is Casey, and I am joined by the wonderful Sarah. Hi, Sarah. How are you?
Hello, I'm doing very well. Did something in particular make you think of dragonflies this week? Or did it just pop into your brain?
I mean, our topic today, spoilies, but you've read the title, wind energy. And so I was like, what animals need the wind? I'm like, flying things. And then it never happens that both an adjective and an animal pop into my head really quickly. And it did this time. And I was like, going for it. I'm just going to run with the energy there. So
fair enough.
I'm
always curious. For those of you listening, if this is your first time, we start every week with a different, usually animal, but something from nature. And it's always funny to just see the other person struggle in the moments before we hit the record button to try to figure out. It's like, if you have a thing in mind, you have zero adjectives to go with it, or you just forget every animal that
and we try and keep them positive too, so
right.
You don't want like something that's mildly insulting to all of our listeners. So so we do our best.
So Casey, last week we talked about the headlines that were coming out about 69% decline in wildlife and kind of what that meant, and you gave us our challenge for the week, which was
keep your eyes out for news about the upcoming conference
of the parties, or whatever it is. That's right.
The parties, yes, which it's basically for the Convention of Biodiversity, taking a look at nations' commitment to nature.
And that starts tomorrow?
Yeah, it starts tomorrow.
So we haven't officially been able to do that challenge yet, but I wanted to say it because it does start tomorrow for us as we're recording this. It's already going on while you're listening, or happened. I don't know how many days it goes.
It's 2 weeks long. It's 2 weeks long, okay. So there's lots of time. And I actually got my first article recommended to me, and I clicked on it.
Yeah, look at you. Read those articles.
I actually learned that, I think it was a Vox article, but they were talking about how a lot of the negotiators who are negotiating the terms of this conference are actually probably some similar people who did the climate stuff.
Okay.
And so they were basically like, these are exhausted negotiators coming off the tail of this. But also that there was recently a conference of parties about CITES, which is a wildlife trading agreement internationally. And so they listed some more species for that too. So I already learned a little bit from a new article, but if you see one popping up that seems like it's going to have some more information for you, check it out.
Look at you go. I had not seen anything come across my news feed yet. But like I said, I did want to mention it because as you're listening to this episode, just keep that in mind. It's going on now. So don't forget to check out your information on that. Casey, you have anything else to share before we dive in question?
I'm ready to dive into wind energy, Sarah.
Well, before we dive into wind energy, I have a very, very random opening question for you.
Okay.
That I hope will end up being related in a sort of roundabout way. The subject of the question is not related. The sort of reasoning behind the question, I hope, will become related. Anyway, it's a would you rather question, Casey. So would you rather? No, it's not, but it's not. It's an opinion. Okay. Would you rather have to live in the town that you're born in for your entire life, or move every month?
Oh,
for the rest of your life.
Live in the town I was born in.
No hesitation.
Sure. Absolutely. Moving is miserable. I just we have done it several times in the last couple of years. I hate doing it. And you don't have a home base with all your friends and stuff.
But okay, two things. That was my initial reaction as well. But I'll say two things. It's never leave the place you're born.
So this is never leave.
Yeah. So I would, if you take that literally to mean you can't even travel.
Shoot.
So never leave the place that you're born or have to move. So if you take it does that change your answer?
I guess it does, because I guess if you are moving every month, you're just going to have a different, like a lot of the logistics of moving, you're just probably going to eliminate. You're going to be like, I don't want to rent all
Just
my
get an RV,
furniture.
right?
Yeah.
Just get a mobile tiny home.
Yeah, I would rather experience the world. And it doesn't say you can't come back to the original place.
No.
No, so I could move back to certain places. I don't like either option, but I guess you're right. If I had to never leave my hometown, guys, if you're around Pottstown, Pennsylvania, you want to get out sometimes. I don't live in Hawaii, so so there's not so much a paradise aspect of it, but I guess I'll go with move every month, but man, that seems like two sad options.
Yeah, it's hard depending on how you, I mean, there's also good things about both, depending, I guess, whether or not you enjoy your hometown.
And like some people don't leave their hometown ever.
Right. Very true. And they're just very connected to their community and their family and, whatever. I was born in Durham, North Carolina, a fact of which I am prouder about than I should be, but I've spent very little time there, but the time that I have spent, I thought it was lovely. And it's a college town. I feel like there'd be stuff to do, whatever. And moving is the worst. Like, moving is the worst. I will say, I just found this question randomly on the internet, and it was actually phrased to stay in the place you were born or have to move every week. And that, I was like, there's definitely no context there. So I changed it to make it, I feel like, a little more of a fair fight. And, you could see things remotely through the internet or whatever if you stayed in the place of your birth. But then I was like, but I do feel like I would want to travel and see things, and you could stay connected to your hometown through the internet. And if you did do something like get an RV, then moving every month would not be as big of a deal. So I think that I also lean towards I would move every month. But it's interesting, depending on how you look at it, depending on how you frame it up and how you weigh the sort of pros and cons, that I could actually make myself go for either option.
Now I'm just interested to see how this connects to wind energy.
I really hope it does. Not wind energy specific in itself, but you'll see. We are going to talk a little bit about wind energy. We're actually going to focus on a couple specific aspects of wind energy. So stick around for that. All right, welcome everyone to our discussion on wind energy, or at least some aspects of wind energy. So we are continuing our energy series, which I really didn't think was going to stretch out as long as it has, but we still have more to do. There's more energy types that we haven't talked about yet. I did approach this one a little bit differently, because if you've been listening, if you've listened to we've done our Energy 101, and we've done nuclear, we've done coal, we've done solar, we've done a few different, you probably have a sense of overall what we're going to say. A lot of what we've been talking about with energy, one of the big reasons that we talk about renewable energy in the environmental world is because we're trying to reduce emissions. And all of these renewable energy types, they just do have enormously fewer emissions compared to fossil fuels. And there's not really so much else that we can say on that. Just anything that you look up is going to go through that. The life cycle assessments and all of that just show, yes, there are different numbers that you can find, but all of them are significantly less than those fossil fuels. So I don't want to dwell too much on that. I will say that, yes, of course, just like other energy types, there are emissions when you're looking at the construction and the maintenance of the turbines, but life cycle assessments take all of that into consideration. So they're emission heavy, like pre-energy generation, but the actual energy generation itself is emission free. And so that all balances out to make those emissions just minuscule compared to fossil fuels. So
we're not this episode gonna harp anymore and try and make an argument about the climate impacts of wind versus fossil fuels. You guys, if you want to hear those conversations, go listen to the solar, go listen to the Energy 101. Just know that like the numbers are in for climate.
Yeah. And we have some of the same studies and graphs and things that we linked to in those episodes also show wind energy. So you can see those numbers there too. I am going to sort of step back around to this a little bit. Not specifically to emissions, but a little bit later on. But yeah, that's not going to be the bulk of energy. I will still kick off with a little bit super fast, just about how wind energy works. And Casey, we have talked about this before. I don't even remember which episodes or what context, but we've both seen wind farms, right? You've been up close to a wind turbine before, is that right?
Yeah, at the university I went to in Northern Ireland, there was like a single wind turbine on campus that we would like sit underneath, and you could hear the like whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of the turbine. So like very, very close.
Yeah, so we've seen them very, very simply put. Wind is going to turn those big turbine blades, and these are very large. I didn't put the numbers down here, but yeah, these are huge structures. So wind is going to turn those turbines. The turbines are connected to a generator, and that generator is going to generate electrical energy from that kinetic energy, and that is going to be transported then along power lines from these wind farms to the national grid. Super simple explanation right there. So we've seen these farms obviously on land. There are also offshore wind farms. All of this could probably be its own episode as well, but I'm not really going to dwell too much on this. I will say offshore compared to these on land wind farms, some people are leaning more towards we should be looking at these offshore farms because they're more efficient. If you've ever been to the coast, whether that's of the ocean or I grew up near the Great Lakes, you probably noticed that when you're out there, there tends to be windier. The wind tends to be more consistent and stronger. So that obviously means more efficient power generation for those offshore turbines. So it requires fewer turbines to produce the same amount of energy as an onshore wind farm. Some people say there's a reduced environmental impact, but we know that there is a potential cost to marine life as well with these. So for me, reading this little bullet point actually requires a little more research, but some people do make the argument that there is a reduced environmental impact.
Yeah, that's definitely something that in the future we could talk more about. I do think it's important to say, like, when we say offshore, these are not like in the middle of a coral reef, for example. Like these tend to be, you can't see them from the beach a lot of times. They're in the deeper open ocean where there's less structures at the bottom of the ocean that might be impacted specifically about, not that there isn't bottom dwelling life, but that there's less structures and habitat going on that would be as dense as something that would be right on the edge of the shore. And
there's a lot of space. Obviously, a lot of our planet is covered in water. So that's something to consider too. There is also a higher cost with construction of these offshore wind farms. So that's a potential con to these. There is also potentially more maintenance and repairs required because of those higher wind speeds and also the water that you're dealing with. And they also point out that there can be the fact that it's farther away from people can also be a negative because sometimes on land wind farms can actually be owned by smaller organizations or even sometimes individuals, whereas these offshore wind farms are always going to be a very commercial enterprise because of how much investment is required in them.
I think it's important to note that like some of this is pretty dynamic as well. So like the higher cost element, for example, over the past just couple years has gone significantly down compared to where it was. Like it almost used to be not worth it to do this because it was so prohibitively costly. But because technology and scaling has gone up, they're building bigger wind turbines than ever before, and it's become cost effective. So that's pretty cool. I also love the idea of thinking of our power sources as something that could be locally owned, because I don't generally conceptualize any energy as being anything other than like this big corporate entity from something that I don't have any control over how much it costs. But it's true, like if we have more community involvement, your local community could have more control over where its power sources comes from, and that would give you more incentive to keep the costs lower for the customer because you're not like getting all of the profits going to some far off place.
Right. I will say, just doing research for this episode, as always, I wish that I had more time because it is so fascinating, and there does seem to be so much changing so quickly.
Yeah.
With these renewable energy types. I found the same thing with solar panels. It's just like you're reading one thing and then you read about, oh, but there might be this advancement, or they're changing this to make this more efficient, and they're changing this to make this more easily recyclable, and that sort of thing. So it is really fascinating to see how kind of quickly these technologies are developing. Also makes it hard to research because you keep going down different rabbit holes.
Yes.
So there's a lot out there on wind that's really interesting to read about. But Casey, I do want to focus this episode mostly on some specific challenges that are associated with wind. So when you think about wind energy, what are kind of the big challenges or arguments maybe that you're familiar with?
Well, there's one that I think of pretty quickly because I think it's, and no offense to anyone out there who feels like this, the silliest one, which is that it's unattractive. The reason I think it's silly is not just because I don't think that they're particularly unattractive, but that a lot of sources of energy are unattractive. Like an oil rig is not attractive. You just might not happen to live next to it and have to think about it.
Right.
And a wind farm might be put in your community because you live in a place that is attractive. But like now you're experiencing energy. I just think that like either way, we're going to have something that no one's going to want to live near. And I rather live near a wind farm than live near a oil rig, for example. So I find that one a little just not as relevant to the actual argument, but that I hear a lot for both that and solar.
I agree. And I think it's interesting too, because I do think wind farms tend to be, the ones on land even tend to be fairly remote. Like I used to drive through wind farms, and there were, I guess, some rural homes. It's like farmland basically. So there were maybe some houses that could see these things, but they don't tend to be in places even where they're going to be huge. But yeah, you do hear that both visual and noise as being an argument for people. Although when I was reading about the decibel level requirements for these farms, they're not particularly obtrusive or anything like that. But you do hear that. You hear those arguments from people. What other ones are you familiar with?
Well, I think the things that become more compelling are collision arguments. So the fact that especially birds make the headlines a lot of colliding with wind farms. And I believe they've actually been sued by government entities based on like Endangered Species Act things because some of those wind farms haven't taken proper precautions to help protect birds. So I'm interested to see kind of what our numbers are.
Yeah, so that's one of the big ones that I wanted to talk about tonight. Is you'll hear for both bats and birds in particular that wind energy poses a threat to those species. So looking into this a little, as with so many things, it's hard to determine actual numbers. So the first kind of main number that popped up for me regarding birds, and this is United States specific, one paper that I was looking at said that annual avian mortality in the United States specifically from collisions with the turbines is 0.2 million. Casey, correct me if I'm wrong. That's 200,000 bird
Correct.
deaths
Yes.
annually. Correct. And they compared that in this paper to 130 million mortalities due to power lines, and anywhere from 300 to 1,000 million, which is a weird way to say that. Yeah, but that's literally how they worded it, from collisions with buildings. So that was kind of the first thing I found. And this paper that I was looking at cited that 200,000 number from a Department of Energy wind vision report. So I looked at that report, and they actually cited another study that I wasn't able to, it didn't have a link or anything like that. So I wasn't able to pull that up. So I started looking around to see, well, is this corroborated anywhere? Is this kind of, what everybody is saying? And I found the American Bird Conservancy website, and they have a whole bunch of information on birds and wind energy on their site, and they argue that this is likely a very low estimate, and do also highlight that this is specifically only looking at collisions with the turbines themselves, and doesn't look at deaths from sort of other threats that wind farms can pose to birds, such as the fact that these farms do need to be connected to the grid. So sometimes power lines are built specifically for these farms. And as was stated in that other paper, birds die from power line interactions as well. So it's not taking into account additional power lines that are constructed for these wind farms. And then they also mention any habitat fragmentation that these wind farms might cause, or habitat sort of alteration, degradation, that might result in challenges for these birds as well. So they look at other studies. They put together a whole kind of series of numbers. Of course, we'll link to all of these, but estimates in the hundreds of thousands, potentially even over 1 million are numbers that they suggest, but it's hard to know exactly. They're all estimates, and it kind of depends on what you want to put under the umbrella of deaths caused by these wind farms.
So yes, and I think we should always be critical of like how things impact wildlife, and I don't want to minimize it, because we've also talked about how there's so many things threats facing birds that eliminating some of these things can help. I do think that this argument often comes out without context, comparing it to other energy sources. So like, we need to get our energy from somewhere. I feel like that needs to always be in our mind, is that we're going to have to get our energy from somewhere. It's not whether or not we build this solar farm or it doesn't exist. It's this energy is going to have to also potentially replace alternatives. And things like coal pollution, fossil fuels, nuclear power plants also have impacts on birds as well. And it's hard to find concrete numbers. Right now, I'm looking at a preliminary study that looked at bird and bat fatalities from wind, fossil fuels, and nuclear energy. And they were looking at it per gigawatt, and fossil fuels have many times more attributed bird deaths per gigawatt energy than wind. So I do feel like we have to always think about that in context. Like, it's not a conversation that excludes other energy sources.
100%. And Casey, does what you're looking at, does it talk about the sources of those mortalities for other energy sources?
It does deeper in here, but I just looked it up right now. So I will link it in the show notes so people can read it.
Yeah, that's fair. I think I have an article somewhere looking at the same thing too. But yeah, so along with what you said, that's what the American Bird Conservancy, I was like, the ABC, what does it stand for? that they acknowledge that as well. So despite the fact that they're saying, look, we think that these bird fatality numbers for wind farms is really low. Like, we don't agree. We think that these wind farms are causing more problems for birds than most of these articles and studies are acknowledging. We still support wind energy. So I think that is actually really important to note. They just want to be careful with how this wind energy is implemented. So they have information on that, and they have this kind of interesting risk assessment map that they put on their website there. And so they kind of want wind farms to avoid these critical areas. When I first pulled up the map, I was like, okay, this like covers
all
the
of it.
entire country. But you can see that they have some areas highlighted as more critical than others, especially the western half of the country is a lot of it they consider a critical habitat. So I think maybe avoiding the most critical habitats and that sort of thing, and putting other mitigation strategies into effect where wind farms are implemented are important. So, but I think it's a cool resource to look at and kind of see what they have there and why they have these areas marked as critical. But I just think overall too, it's important that they acknowledge that wind energy is part of the solution, because we know that climate change is going to impact bird species as well. And it's really hard to put numbers on those types of things, but they basically say that, yeah, if we don't do anything and we keep using these fossil fuels as our energy sources and we're not doing anything to mitigate climate change, things are going to be bad for these birds also. So yes, let's do these renewable energy sources, but let's try to do them as reasonably as possible with what we know about how they can threaten these bird species.
Yeah, and I think that's why people latch on to the bird fatality argument too, is that it's really easily to conceptualize. We've all seen a bird hit a window and like understand that. And so you can really quantify it a lot more easily than you can say there was a coal plant and now there was acid rain, and that acid rain impacted this waterway and then birds died because that was contaminated. It feels like too many steps in the story. It seems vague, and like, can you actually pinpoint it to one particular source? Maybe not as easily as the wind farm, but doesn't mean it didn't make a difference.
Right. And there are solutions already in play for bird and wind farm interactions as well. There are both human and technological monitoring systems that some wind farms are utilizing to identify birds in the area, and some of them will use like auditory deterrence, like there will be audible noises to scare the birds away, or if it's a human monitoring system, they can recommend curtailment. So basically, hey, we've got, a potential issue with birds coming in, stop these turbines or whatever. So that's interesting. And I think they're, working on developing more kind of technological based solutions on that end. And then some recent articles that I've seen popping up would talk about painting the turbines black, or painting, I guess, just one turbine black. Have you heard about this at all?
I have. It seems like a very simple solution that is deceptively simple.
Well, what's interesting is I saw recent articles popping up, but then when I started to look into it, there were things coming up from a couple of years ago too. So I was like, oh, if it's really that simple, why haven't we implemented? And I think there's still just not enough data. So this goes back to your challenge from last week of making sure that you actually read articles instead of just headlines, because there was one article that was basically saying we see like a 70% decrease in bird mortality with wind turbines when you by painting the turbines black. And I was like, dang, why aren't we doing this all the time? And then you read the study, and this was a study, it was done in Norway, but it only looked at 8 turbines. 4 of them were painted black. And over the course of the years, they did monitor over several years. I think it was like 10 years total. Don't quote me 100% on that. But they monitored these 8 turbines for several years before and after painting, for a grand total of 42 bird collisions over that time. So it's not a very high sample.
It's not a robust data set.
Yes, exactly.
We can't necessarily say that, especially
right.
It would be interesting to look at that in an area of high migration.
Yeah.
And see if that impacts like over the course of the year, or if there's certain times a year that, like, I don't know, they've got mating on the brain that they don't care about it,
right.
or what. Yeah, that seems like a lot to extrapolate.
And
out of
is it going to be site specific or species specific, or, you know, is this going to work for different species of birds? So sounds pretty cool. Could be really helpful. Needs more data, but it is a potential solution. And the idea is that it helps with, I can't remember the terminology now, but basically, you know, when things get blurry when they're moving really quickly and you can't see
they don't paint
clearly.
them all. They just like paint.
They paint one.
Yeah.
So that basically they would see.
blur.
So they would sort of see this black blur basically. So that's kind of the idea behind it. So I hope they do. I don't know if there's any more active research being done on that right now, but it certainly seems like it would be a easy, not super expensive solution if it really is helpful. So things in play for birds. And then with bats, there's less data available as compared to birds and wind turbines, but there are some sort of just interesting things that come up with bats. So bat fatalities are generally from direct collision with the turbine. So we're like where we talk about with birds, there may be other
power lines and things,
but for bats, it seems like it's direct collision with the turbines is their biggest threat. And what's interesting is that it doesn't seem like it's just a case of them not seeing it, like they're just flying through and they don't see it. They seem to, for some reason, be attracted to the turbines. Like they're flying around almost and like exploring them.
I mean, that's so interesting because they're not relying on their vision. They're relying on their echolocation sensibility. So I wonder if the noise from it interferes with that to some level, or if they're just like, whoa, this is noisy. What's going on?
I don't know,
here?
but that's a potential solution that they're looking at too, is using like acoustic deterrence for them to make it sort of uncomfortable for them to be around these turbines, because it doesn't seem like it is making them uncomfortable. So can we make it uncomfortable for them? But so that's interesting in and of itself. Like, and more work is going to be done to study that as well. Fatalities unsurprisingly increased during fall migration. So there are some specific bat species that seem to have the biggest issues, those migrating bat species that seem to have the bigger issues with the wind turbines. And it seems very logical to me that, of course, fatalities would increase during periods of migration. And fatalities are also higher during periods of low wind speed. Again, that tends to be when our bats are going to be more active. So it makes sense. But there's a lot that needs to be learned about bats and their behavior around these wind turbines. So earlier this year, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, the NREL, which I feel like has come up a few times in our series, gave funding to 3 different studies on bats and wind energy, looking at where and how these bats are spending their time, you know, hopefully just helping us, I guess, figure out sort of what deterrent is going to work best for these. If we know why they're spending their time where they are, we can kind of figure out how to keep them away from it. And then, of course, we can't talk about bats without bringing up our favorite bat conservation organization, Bat Conservation International. And much like the American Bird Conservancy, they have similar feelings on bats and wind energy, and that it's acknowledging that it's a threat to species, but still supporting wind energy. wanting to work with the stakeholders involved to make sure that we can continue to develop this energy source in a way that's going to be safe for the bats. So they also have a great page with some information in their thoughts and what they're doing to find solutions. That's including working with researchers, the government, non-governmental organizations, and wind turbine manufacturers to determine what can be done to make things as safe as possible for bats. And again, there are some solutions already in play, like those acoustic deterrents that I mentioned. And again, it seems really straightforward to me that if we know fatalities are highest during migration and highest during low wind speed, especially because less energy is produced when wind speeds are lower anyway, that stopping turbines during periods of low wind would be an easy, relatively not costly solution to just have a minimum wind cutoff, max. I don't know how you would
minimum,
say that.
yeah, I think
but
when
when the wind goes below a certain threshold, you stop the turbines because they're not going to be generating much energy, if any, anyway.
Yeah, I wonder, I mean, one of the arguments against some of these sources like wind is that they are intermittent energies. They're not a consistent source of energy. So I can see where that would be a challenge for the wind producer. Like even if they're producing a certain amount of energy, even if it's below what their optimal level is, we still need energy. So I don't know. Maybe I just don't think that a wind operator would be convinced of this argument. Maybe that's my thing. I think they'd rather paint a blade than stop a turbine.
Well, I'm sure that's true. But also, I don't know. And I guess that's the thing that I need to read a little bit more about is what is the minimum wind speed at which a turbine is going to generate any electricity. Anyway, I don't know. To me, it makes sense if, again, just during this period of migration, at least, if there were some kind of standard in play.
I was gonna say, I think it's a government regulation thing. I just don't see it as a voluntary implementation
that's what I mean.
from a company.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I feel like that would be the case. So that is the biggest one to me that I feel like I hear about with wind energy is just this sort of wildlife hindrance. And it was interesting to kind of read a little bit more about that to see what the numbers actually were and how big of a problem this actually is, and to know that conservation organizations specifically dedicated to this species are still saying, hey, we support wind energy. Basically, we just need to be thoughtful about where we do it, and we need to be continuing to work on making it safer for these species. So that's good to know from those experts in that field. The other one that I wanted to mention sort of circles back to emissions a little bit, but I wanted to mention it because this is a thing that I have seen multiple times on social media, and I think it just brings up a couple of points that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about these things. So this is a post that involves a wind farm in Mount Pulaski, Illinois. I don't know where that place is, but so I'm just going to read what this post says.
I also want to just preference it with, this is not true.
Yeah, it's absolutely just completely 100% false. But the post says that this wind farm in Mount Pulaski has been running for 3.5 years, and that they have been replacing all of the generators in their wind towers. And they say that there's 100 generators in this wind farm, so evidently the lifespan on the generator is about 3 to 4 years. It goes on to say that it takes 12 semi-trucks and trailers, a 9-axle, 500,000-pound crane, a 100,000-pound crane, and 12 pickup trucks to change each generator. And that it's a huge amount of fuel being used to maintain these wind towers. And it's apparently attributed to someone named Glenn Perkins. But I've seen just it posted and shared and screenshotted by different names of strangers, people I don't know, but then it's shared by people. So it's just one of those things that's gone viral multiple times, attributed to different people. It's just absolutely, there's nothing true about it, and yet it gets shared and passed on, as so many things do.
It has just enough specificity to feel like a thing that if you already feel, yeah.
I just don't know. I don't know if this is ever something that anybody originally actually wrote. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Or if
Yeah.
it was just one that, like if somebody actually thought this, or if it was just some completely bogus thing that somebody
made
purposefully
up,
put out there to mislead people. But the fact is that this has been debunked by everybody, including the company that owns the farm. That the post doesn't name the wind farm, but it shows a picture of an actual wind farm there was like a utility truck in the photo or something like that. But the company that owns the wind farm in the post said that the farm replaced 17 gearboxes, not 100 generators. Wind turbines are expected to last 20 to 25 years, not 3 to 4 years. Certainly, maintenance is going to be required sometimes on turbines. That is true with literally anything, any energy source, but anything that is built needs maintenance. Your house needs maintenance. Your car needs maintenance. A wind turbine is going to need maintenance. So going after wind
is a job too. Like, I feel like the same people who would be maybe frustrated about wind energy's details would also be people who care about the economic job loss associated with reducing fossil fuels. Like, that is one of the main arguments I ever hear about keeping coal and fossil fuels around, is people are employed by this. Well, people are also employed by wind farms too to maintain them.
Yeah, for sure. So again, it's just, I bring this up for a few reasons. One is because I wanted to fact check it. When I first read it, I was like, dang, like if this wind farm really is having to replace their generators that often, how
sustainable is it?
What is that? Yeah, I want to know if this is accurate or not. So I think that is a good thing to do when we see information. Again, going back to read the articles, not just the headlines. If you see something shared like this that you're like, yeah, man, that doesn't sound good, take a second, look it up. Like, I literally just put Mount Pulaski wind farm generators into Google search to see what would come up, and was very quickly like, oh, okay, this isn't true. So I think it is good to read things that don't align with your views. When I was sitting down to do this podcast, I definitely looked up specifically, looking for what the arguments were against wind energy and how does it stack up. That's a good thing. But then, question things too, I guess. Does that make sense? Did I say any of that clearly?
Well, I think all of that's correct, but to clarify it from my perspective is you should always try and find things that might challenge your assumptions about things. If you have a gut feeling about something, it's nice to have data that backs it up. But also, especially on social media, if you see something like this that feels like it might be a real story, it's like the headlines thing. You have to do the next step, which is look at it. Even I once shared actually a graph that showed bird deaths based on different types of energy sources, because I was trying to debunk the whole wind energy is the worst thing for birds situation. And one of my friends from college commented on it and was like, you shared this without a lot of context, and I fact checked it and found that it is accurate. It has some accuracy to it. It's based on a study, but it's always important to make sure that you cite the source that it's from, because anyone can make a graph on the internet and post it to say what they want it to. And it was a good point, because it was something I posted because I had a gut feeling that I agreed with it, and that data supported my view. But I didn't do that backup research, and he went and posted the link in the comments to show it. But it was a good yeah, I agree with this, and it turns out it's true, but you also didn't do enough research to actually share it without the context. And fair enough. I got called out, and it was the right thing for him to do.
Yeah. So it's tough in the world that we live in. There's so much information out there. There's so much misinformation out there. And things are complicated, not everything is black and white. I have this fear basically every time we do a podcast that I'm going to share something that is going to come back to be like, oh, was that really the most accurate thing that I could have said, or the way, So anyway, there's a lot to it. I had seen this multiple times, and so I just felt like it was important to share, because I think, whereas in your example, Casey, you were sharing something that maybe didn't have a lot of context, this is just completely wrong. like there's nothing.
But, well, I guess like to follow up, it's not just that mine didn't have enough context. Mine happened to be accurate, but it's a good reminder to everyone that like anyone can make a graph, and anyone can use out of context numbers to make the graph say whatever they want. So yeah, do that next step and make sure that what you're sharing actually is what you think it is.
Yeah. So what we know about wind turbines and their maintenance is that, like we said at the beginning, is that there's just no comparison to those fossil fuels in terms of the emissions and the environmental cost there. So just know that. There are other potential environmental concerns with wind farms too. I mean, certainly land use is a concern, like we talked about with birds. So we do want to be thoughtful about where we're placing these wind turbines and looking at, doing environmental assessments on those areas. Materials are also an issue. The turbines are going to reach end of life at some point, just like we talked about with solar panels. And so we do need to make sure that we're continuously looking at how that's going to work and improving those resources. The blades, from what I understand, are maybe the bigger piece of concern with wind turbines, is actually the blade disposal. They're not super easily recyclable as constructed right now. But like I said, I just feel like articles were popping up every day about, oh, look at this new style of wind turbine blade. So there's still potential for improvement there. And I was reading too about what they're doing with some of them right now. Instead of sending them to landfill, is actually breaking them down and using them for filler in concrete, which we know that concrete isn't the most environmentally friendly thing either, but perhaps a way to keep those blades from going to landfill. So to try to circle around back to the beginning, you see, with my would you rather question.
I'm still curious about where we're going with this.
Really? Okay, well, it probably doesn't work as well as I was hoping that it would. But basically, like we've said, no energy source is perfect. Wind, just like any other, is not perfect. People are going to have differing opinions about what the best solutions are. And just because something has environmental costs, just because something isn't perfect, doesn't mean that we can't make them work. So just like having to live in the same place that you're born in for the rest of your life is not an ideal situation. Neither is having to move every month for the rest of your life. Neither of those things are great. Both of them have pros. Both of them have cons. You and I might agree or disagree about which way can be better, but there are things that we could do to make either one of them more manageable. Does that make sense? So that's how I feel when I look at wind energy compared to solar, compared to nuclear, or some of these other energy types. And that's just kind of what it's come down to for me, is as we're doing this kind of energy series, I can't tell you what I think the best way. Yeah, I can't rank the energy sources in terms of what I think is the most environmentally friendly or what I think is the best option for us right now. It's not a perfect analogy, because what I actually we're going to have to do is use all of them. So that doesn't work as a would you rather. But do you get what I'm saying? Like
I think like, yes, it's always going to be a yes and for all of these. It's like, these are going to work in different scenarios. I think the thing to keep in mind is, to me, continuing down the path that we are currently taking down is like, would you rather move all the time or stay in the same place? Or would you rather the entire world around you be on fire? And like, that's really more of the choice of what we're doing, is like two options that maybe aren't amazing, or one option that is just not livable, like not literally on fire, but like an option that doesn't isn't conducive to life and that is remarkably worse than either of those options. Does that make sense? I'm being hyperbolic, but
you went further with it than I was in my mind. I was just looking at our more environmentally friendly options and saying it's hard to you can't necessarily say with certainty that this is better than the other. And yes, there are going to be negative things about them. But either one is something that we can deal with. Yes, I see your point as well. If you add in the like continuing on and doing absolutely nothing as being another, right. Yeah. So
I just don't want coal to hang out as one of those options. It's right. Like, no. We know actually that that's markedly worse than either of the other options. So throw that behind you because it's not one that we're actually should be considering. Yeah.
Yes. Fair enough. So, but that's kind of where I've landed though with this whole thing is much like the other renewables that we've talked about. Wind energy has its pluses and minuses. I like it as a potential energy source. I'm curious to see, where we progress from here. Stick around for our challenges of the week coming up. All right, friends, thanks for listening. Casey, thanks for chatting about wind farms this evening. My challenge for the week is pretty simple. I was really struggling to come up with a challenge for this one tonight. But I think what it comes down to is like we were saying, this is a good option. This is a good option of a few options that we have to continue moving on with. So I think the challenge is just to learn a little bit more about what progress is happening with wind farms potentially near you. So see if you can find out if there are any wind farm projects on the table in your area. Again, area is kind of vague for a reason. Just look around, see what might be in development. If there is anything, is there any opposition? Are there people in your area talking about this, like it, don't like it? If it's relevant, voice your opinion on it. And I think also to check out I'm going to post the link to that American Bird Conservancy map, just so you can kind of see where you're at on that map and where they have you ranked in terms of critical habitat as related to birds and wind farms.
Yeah. Okay, guys, just to quick, put a little button on that. I just did my quick Google search, see if I can get my homework out of the way pretty early. Wild. I went on Wikipedia and it was like, oh, wind farms in Pennsylvania. And quickly it was like Montgomery County, which is where I live, became the first wind-powered county in the nation. And I was like, wait, what? And so I clicked on it, and I don't think that is a completely accurate statement, but I clicked on it, and I guess it was like from my town that I live in, they have announced a wind energy purchase that the county's electrical accounts, at least for maybe the county itself, maybe not everybody's personal power, is going to be from wind energy. So
wow.
Yeah, I was like, not around here. There's not a lot of wind, but I guess, I'll talk more about it next week when I do a little more research about it.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to that. And yeah, thanks, Casey, for chatting. Thanks for your thoughts, opinions, clarifications. And folks, if you listening have anything to share, if you have questions, if you have a story, if you have a suggestion for a future episode, you can find us all over the place. We're on Facebook, A Little Greener Podcast. We're on Instagram at A Little Greener Pod. We're on Twitter at A Greener Podcast. And you can email us at alittlegreenerpodcast@gmail.com.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everybody, for listening. We'll talk to you next week.